Good afternoon and welcome. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Michael J. Burgess. Grew up in Watertown, New York, and graduated from St. Lawrence University. After college, he moved to Albany. In 2007, he was appointed the director of the New York State Office for the Aging by the Governor Eliot Spitzer. I'm there until November 2010. His work has appeared in Newsdays, the Albany Times Union, Adirondack Life, and the New York State Archives magazine. He is the author of Rose Crysack and the Senior Action Movement in New York, A Long Shot to Glory, How Lake Placid Saved the Winter Olympics and Restored the National Pride. Keeper of the Olympic Flame, Lake Placid, Jack Shea versus Avery Brundage, and the Nazi Olympic. He will be speaking today about his book, Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt in Albany, Governing New York. Please help me to welcome Michael J. Burgess.
Well, I hope I got this set up right here. Well, thank you for the introduction, and thank you to the Roosevelt Museum and Library and the Friends of the Poughkeepsie Library for hosting this. And it's always a great feeling to be in such history here in Hyde Park. I was here 2 years ago talking about the original version of this book, which has been republished now by the History Press. I was here on August 13th, 14th, 1985, with thousands of people for the 50th anniversary of Social Security. I was here on August 14th, 2005, for the 70th anniversary of Social Security. And God willing, on August 14, 2035, I'll be here for the 100th anniversary of Social Security. And really, I'm mentioning that because my background is such that I had an interest in this topic because I worked in the field of aging. I was, as you heard, not just with the state, but had lobbied for a number of years in Albany on issues related to the aging, enactment of prescription drug coverage here in the state long before Medicare had that coverage. And so I had an interest in Franklin Roosevelt and wanted to know, well, what did he do when he was in Albany? I heard he enacted an old age pension act and was concerned about that way back then before Social Security. And that's true, and we'll talk about that. Also, having worked for New York State government, I wondered what would it be like to be working for Governor Roosevelt back in the 30s, you know, knowing what I know now about working in that environment in Albany for Governor Spitzer, you remember him, and Governor Patterson. And then finally, you know, my father was a local radio personality up in the North Country where I grew up, and I had this family picture which when he passed away, I've kept of my father interviewing Eleanor Roosevelt at the State University of Potsdam when she was visiting to discuss the arts programs up there. So all of those things were things that inspired me along the way. So I want to just get into you know, the theme, if I had assigned a title for my talk, it would be that the New Deal really started in Albany, because the Great Depression happened during the time that Roosevelt was governor. And I'll just briefly tell you, you know, the theme and what about it, and then we'll go back and say how did he get to Albany, how did he become governor? And some of you may know this story, but I certainly learned a lot when I was researching this and went to the state archives, as well as tapping during the COVID years online, tapping the archives here at this library. But if you think about what he did in Albany, he was governor from January 1st of 1929 till December 31st of 1932. 4 years. The terms were only 2 years in those days, so he won 2 times. But looking back now, during the Depression in Albany, he started the Temporary Emergency Relief Act that started the Tree Army. And what did that become in Washington, D.C. years later? Yes, the Civilian Conservation Corps. He was chair of the Conservation Committee in the State Senate in Albany in 1911. The Power Authority of New York State was signed into law when he was governor. And those ideas about that became something when he became president, named something similar, the Tennessee Valley Authority. Some of the ideas were very similar to that. Old age pensions, I mentioned, though it was not like Social Security, and we'll talk about that as well. He gave those first, they weren't fireside chats, but those radio chats really began on WGY radio in Schenectady in 1929. He immediately saw that using this new medium was something that he could use to appeal, especially in the upstate areas, which were Republican controlled, you know, and so he thought that some of the newspapers weren't always in his favor, but he thought the radio was a good way to reach people. And then when he left Albany, he took a lot of people with him: Perkins, Hopkins, Morgenthau, Rosenman, and a brain trust of other people. So we'll talk about that as I go along here. I would like you to keep this in mind. We think of FDR as one of the most successful presidents. He won 4 times. And you think he was a shoo-in because he was wealthy. He had the name Roosevelt. But the odds were always sort of against him with his health, especially after he got polio and could never walk again. He started off in politics and wasn't very well liked in Albany, which I'll tell you about by some people. But it was really his personal charm in his later years and his ability to relate to people in a confident manner in the midst of the crisis at hand in the Depression that propelled him forward. I would like to say, when I wrote in the beginning of my book that anybody here know the show Downton Abbey? I'm sure you do. This was, to me, you know, sort of like Downton Abbey on the Hudson here, because his family was wealthy, had this big estate. I mean, they weren't as wealthy as some of the others around here. But when you think about Franklin being the Lord of the Manor and his mother, Sarah, being like Maggie Smith in Downton Abbey, that's the parallel I often made in my mind. Obviously not exact, but it was kind of the idea of the time. There was the other Roosevelt family, of course, in Oyster Bay, Long Island. Now, you all know the story, you know. How did he get to Albany? I'm going to kind of retrace that a little bit. You know that his cousin was Teddy. His wife Eleanor he was her uncle. And so even though they were of 2 different parties, they were both fairly progressive people at that time. And Franklin, at the age of 28, decided he was going to run for the state Senate in this area, which I guess had been controlled by Republicans and had a Republican representative. And he went out and campaigned. And in 1910, he was elected on the Democratic line here. Not as a traditional Democrat, because people equated Tammany Hall in New York City, a machine kind of city politics, with the Democrats in state government. And he came to Albany as a progressive reformer, not Tammany. He didn't stay long. He only stayed actually 1 term, and he actually endorsed Woodrow Wilson for president in 1912. And Woodrow Wilson then appointed him to be Assistant Secretary of the Navy, a job that Teddy Roosevelt had. And Franklin actually, looked upon Teddy as kind of a hero, and he wanted to emulate him in a lot of ways. One thing I've never really, I'd like to read more about, and I'll have to find somebody here who knows about this, but Franklin was a Democrat, and Teddy ran for president out of retirement in 1912 against Wilson, but Franklin endorsed Wilson as Teddy ran on the Bull Moose ticket. So maybe I'll have to read more about that, whether Teddy got in kind of later in the year after Franklin had already gotten involved. But he was a Democrat, so he was supporting Wilson. So off to Washington he went during World War I and served as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. The war ended, he came back. His name was floated for state politics. Al Smith became governor in 1919. And Franklin ended up on the ticket of the Democratic Party in 1920 as the vice presidential candidate. Teddy had died the year before. He was actually thinking of running again in 1920 after Wilson was out of office. And Teddy was young. I think he was only 59 when he dropped dead in 1919. So it ended up that Franklin, ran on the ill-fated ticket with James Cox, I believe, and they ended up losing, and Warren G. Harding became president. And you probably know now that at that point, the year after that, he got polio in 1921 at the family home up in Maine. And that was really at the point when I said he was never a shoo-in. Nobody knew whether he would come back from that. Lewis Howe, who was his chief political operative, sort of like James Carville in our present time for Bill Clinton, he said we've got to keep his name alive and out there, and while he's recovering, and hopefully he will recover to the point where he could get back involved in politics. And he said to Eleanor, who had been a mother with 6 children, one who passed away young, he said, you're going to have to go out and represent him at many of these events. Now think of this, in 1920, women had just gotten the right to vote. Eleanor had not been active. She always said it was her husband's role. She was filling in for him. But he coached her on how to go out and speak to groups, and she did. And she got involved with the state women's division of the Democratic Party at that time. And Franklin's reappearance in politics, it's 100 years ago. I don't know if the museum will be doing anything with this, but 100 years ago this year at the 1924 Democratic Convention, he comes back and he is there to second the nomination of, or I'm trying to remember if one of them, I think in 1920 he gave the seconding speech, but he nominated Al Smith to be president. And it was a terribly difficult thing to get him on crutches and braces and to walk across the stage at Madison Square Garden. That was the famous convention of 103 ballots, and they ended up with John W. Davis as the nominee who lost. But Franklin made a triumphant return. When people heard his voice, apparently they just almost forgot that he, had such a disability. And he, of course, it wasn't all that prominently known that he did have the disability of being able to have difficulty walking. But he got out there and he called Al Smith the happy warrior, and it was a memorable speech. But then he goes back to Warm Springs, Georgia for the next few years and tries to get more therapy, becomes very involved, buys the resort, and ends up spending a lot of time there. 1928, Smith's running for president again. And Smith is thinking about not only how he's going to run, but who's going to run New York State if he leaves as governor. And he decides that he thinks Franklin Roosevelt would be the best. The Roosevelt name, the fact that he's from upstate. New York in 1928, hard to believe, but we were a swing state, kind of like Pennsylvania is right now, or Wisconsin. It was a divided state. The downstate was always Democrat and upstate was Republican. And Smith thought that Roosevelt would help him upstate if he was running for governor on the ticket. Roosevelt didn't want to run. He said, I'm still getting therapy. I'm still not to the point where I want to be. And Smith is at the state Democratic convention where they're looking to nominate a candidate for governor, and he wants to get him on the phone. and he can't get him on the phone. And finally, ELEANOR decides to tell Smith that he can try to call him himself and reach him. And Smith talks Franklin into understanding this is your duty to do this as a Democrat at this time. And Franklin Roosevelt accepts that. They kind of told him, well, you don't have to worry about the campaigning too much. We'll have the lieutenant governor candidate, Herbert Lehman, will do a lot of this for you. But Franklin Roosevelt, proves them right from the beginning that he's not going to be a wallflower. He barnstorms the state, traveling all over the state, campaigning. And there's a couple quotes from my book I want to read about that 1928 campaign. He started talking about old age pensions right away in 1928. And he said that, and I'm not finding it here, but I can remember what it was. He started by saying that he was very upset about the fact that older people at that time, there was no Social Security. I mean, when you stopped working, unless you'd saved a lot of money, you didn't have much. And so he worried about that, and he said he wanted to create some kind of a program for older people. He said that in a speech that he gave in Rochester in 28 as he was going around the state. And another quote was that he was campaigning and there was such an effort that they had to get him to be able to speak. They would say to the reporters, no movies of me getting out of the machine, boys, you know, the wheelchair. He had to be carried up a fire escape into a meeting hall, and his son Jimmy, who had just come back from Europe, saw his father being carried up like a sack of potatoes. It was very upsetting to him. That was the extent, you know, and as you know from history, there were not a lot of photographs of him in the wheelchair for a long time. A lot of them were of him standing with his crutches, or, you know, people knew he had braces on. So that was the dilemma that he faced as governor in those early years. But it was really a chance for him in the 4 years in Albany to try out being a leader, an executive, and he immediately established a lot of confidence with people. Now, the election for governor. Al Smith, it's a swing state. He loses by a big margin to Herbert Hoover. Franklin Roosevelt goes to bed thinking he's lost too. He wakes up the next morning, he's been elected governor by 25,000 votes. Not a lot, but he did so much better upstate than Smith that he was able to carry the day. So the next day, he becomes the governor-elect of New York. And coming to Albany, he wants to make a few adjustments that will make it easier for him. He's leaving Warm Springs. They convert the greenhouses at the governor's mansion into a swimming pool. So that was one change. They put an elevator in the governor's mansion at that time. Those are all still there today. Actually, I think a few years ago, they converted it back into a swimming pool when Andrew Cuomo was governor in recent years. So he becomes governor at a time, it was during Prohibition. That was a big issue at the time. New York State was the largest state in the country with the most electoral votes at 47, 12 million people. Today we're losing population and electoral votes, even though we have, I think, 19 or 20 million people. He becomes governor at the time when the legislature is still controlled by Republicans. He's underestimated. People from the beginning wonder, well, what will he be able to do physically? Will he be able to do the job? Oh, Lehman will help him a lot doing the job. What will he be able to do? Maybe he's a lightweight. You know, when he was here in the state Senate, he was kind of a lightweight. In fact, Francis Perkins thought he was very, very snobby. He was a tall guy, you know, in the days before polio, and he had the glasses here. And she said he used to look like he was looking down his nose at me when I would talk with him. She was a lobbyist, Frances Perkins, in those days. She had been there and watched the Triangle Shirtwaist factory fire in 1911 happen in New York City. And she was lobbying for Consumer League at that point, trying to get changes in regulations about factories. But anyway, she had been appointed by Smith to serve in the Labor Department. and Roosevelt kept her on, and she became a big fan of his. Now, one of the things that Franklin Roosevelt set out in his initial inaugural address was that he wanted to do the things I mentioned earlier about the power project in the hydroelectric. He believed in public power. He wanted the people to get the benefit for their electric bills of like they did in Canada for paying cheaper electric, and rather than having it be controlled by corporate powers. He wanted to see the Old Age Pensions Act. He wanted some other kinds of changes for taxes, especially for farmers. He came from this area. He viewed himself as a farmer, and so he was very interested in agriculture as well. And he was a reformer. He wanted to change some of the practices in Albany that we would see. Now, one of the things that I want to quote here is from Frances Perkins. She wrote a book about Franklin. And here's what she talked about in the governor's mansion in those early days. There were nieces, nephews, cousins, school friends of the Roosevelt boys. Roosevelt moved in this family commotion with joyous relish. They entertained a great deal, inviting people to dinner from all over the state. If a person came from a distance, there was often an invitation to spend the night at the mansion. Night after night, every bed was full, and visiting friends of long acquaintance were asked to double up. That doesn't happen anymore at the governor's mansion in Albany. And we're lucky if we have a governor who lives there. I mean, most of the governors are there during the week when the legislature is in session. I think, trying to remember, and I know Mario Cuomo did live in the mansion, but the others since then have kind of lived in it sporadically, you know. The other thing that Frances Perkins said from the very beginning, after the legislative session ended in Albany, the first 3 months, sort of the period we're in now, they're doing the budget right now. And after the budget was over, he went on radio and he gave a talk and kind of explained what went on and complained a little bit that the legislature had 3 months to do this, just like now. It's unbelievable. They had 3 months. They send me all these bills at the end of the month. They could have worked on this for earlier and we wouldn't have had this rush at the end. And Frances Perkins said that when he talked on the radio, he saw them, the constituents, in the little parlor at home, listening with their neighbors. His voice and his facial expressions that she saw were that of an intimate friend. So he learned right away how to use the radio. And I know many of you have probably heard him on old tapes, maybe old audios, and that voice was such a reassuring one. I'm too young to have remembered it in those days, but I've heard it since. And as I said, you know, once he started speaking, my friends, all thoughts about him being unable to do the job or even that he was unable to walk, you kind of like put that in the back of your mind. One of the things I found very interesting was that after this legislative session ended, he and Eleanor would go out on tour of the state facilities and see what was going on when the state had, you know, they didn't have all the things they have now, but they had prisons and psychiatric facilities, state hospitals. So he and Eleanor went out in 1929, driving around the state. And Eleanor wrote this. He would drive up and go on a ride around the facilities with the building superintendent. Let's say they went to a state hospital or something. She would go in and be his eyes and ears and look around. At first, my reports were highly unsatisfactory to him. I would tell him what was on the menu for the day, and he would ask, well, did you look to see whether the inmates actually were getting the food? So she learned to check the mattresses in the closets and look under the tops of kettles on the stove. Imagine the governor and first lady doing that now. But that was the way that they interpreted that they wanted to do the job, you know. And she was, again, she wasn't like at the point of her activism that we saw later, but she was interested in being involved right from the very beginning. And she showed that in her situation in Albany. Let me check my time here. Okay. Oh, wow. Well, we're gonna move along here. So the next point really is that all of this changed 10 months into his time as governor. It all changed because the Great Depression happened in October of 1929. And At first, it seemed like it wouldn't be an ongoing calamity that we now know that it was. But right away, President Hoover, he wasn't taking it seriously. And Franklin Roosevelt kind of let's see what happens. Hopefully things will be correcting themselves in the markets. But after a few months, it was clear it was not going to happen. The stock market bounced back a little bit, then it went into an even greater tailspin. So here's what Franklin Roosevelt had to say a few months after as governor of New York. The situation is serious, and the time has come for us to face the unpleasant fact that as dispassionately and constructively as a scientist faces a test tube of deadly germs, we have to approach this. And I put that quote in there because so much of his life was dealing with deadly germs. I mean, he got the Spanish flu coming back from World War I, long before COVID. I mean, like COVID days. He got smallpox. He got polio. It was something before, in our time, before COVID, we didn't have to worry too much about it since maybe we were kids and had our shots. But back then it was something that everybody was worried about. So when he said that, he said, this is the way you have to approach it as a scientist, the economic problems we're facing. Hoover said, all the evidence indicates that the worst effects of the crash upon unemployment will have passed within the next 60 days. So you saw right away that one person had a different kind of view about that. Of course, Hoover, probably historically in retrospect got a bad rap for being there during the Depression, and he did do some things, but it changed everything for Franklin Roosevelt, as I said, in terms of governing New York. And immediately the state had to look at something that had never been done before. This was a country until that time where everybody was supposed to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. The government, if you got any help from the government, which didn't exist really, it was welfare. And when he started talking about his belief that we couldn't continue to see people selling apples on the street, that there were 2 million people out of 12 million unemployed. And that's 2 million out of probably less than that who were in the working age population. So he decides that we need to do things to help people have a job. And that's why I talked about the Tree Army being a specific example. He brings Harry Hopkins in from being a social worker in New York City to run this Temporary Emergency Relief Act. They're going to put people to work. Never been done before. Some people complained, this sounds like socialism. And didn't the Russians just have a communist revolution not that far? That was lurking in the background, to people. But Roosevelt said it's the right thing to do. We need to have a way for people to have their dignity. So they create that program, TERA. He runs for re-election in 1930. He won in 1928 by 25,000 votes. The work that he did with depression and with old age pensions, which I forgot and I'm going to come back to, he wins re-election by 750,000 votes, the biggest margin ever at that time. So you can see that he had made quite an impression. I forgot, me, the guy who does aging, I forgot to mention how they did this bill. The Old Age Pension Act got passed in the spring of 1930 before he ran for re-election. And the bill, it reminded me a lot of some of my lobbying that I did at the legislature. They put up a study commission to look into this issue because it had been an issue all over the country. There were clubs forming called Townsend clubs to get a pension or get a payment for older people so they wouldn't live in poverty. And remember, in those days, there was a poorhouse and an almshouse. That's where you went if you couldn't afford anything. And so they wanted to do they had hearings. People lobbied them from senior groups, just like today. And they ended up passing a bill that provided a payment to people, a small payment to people of a certain amount if you were over 70 years old. I'm going to find out here exactly the amount of money it was. But it was not exactly what he wanted. He wanted a social security system. He wanted you to pay into it, a workplace or a workers' payroll deduction system like we now have, because he felt you need to own this. It can never be taken away from you. So he signed that bill, but he lamented that it wasn't exactly what he wanted. He would get letters. I'm 80 years of age with no means of support. My sons fought in France during the World War and 2 are dead as a result. I'm now visiting here, Louisiana, with one of the others and would like to return home. Please advise me if such a law has been enacted, and if it has, please send me an application to fill it out. So on January 1st, 1931, after this bill passed, persons 70 and older got an average of $242 a year. 51,000 persons who were needy. The cost was $12.5 million divided between the states and the counties. That was the first effort that there were a few other states that also did something like that, but it was not Social Security as we know it today, okay? Anyway, so just to kind of tie up this part of it, and then we'll take some questions. Basically, what we're talking about here is that by this point, having won by such a huge margin, being the governor of the biggest state in the country, having the name Roosevelt, being in a depression, people looking at that, as Eleanor said, he believed that we had 48 states that gave us the right to experiment with things to see if they would work. And that's why he tried the tree army and the other things that he did. And so he decided that, or other people were deciding that he would be a great person to be the nominee of the Democratic Party in 1932. And Al Smith, who felt that he was treated to discrimination as a Catholic in 1928, that he had been a progressive governor and then the Depression hit, that he should get credit for some of that and be the nominee in 1932. But he got into the race against Roosevelt late. They had a kind of a little falling out. But by this time, Roosevelt had declared his candidacy early in 1932, and he won. You know, they didn't decide it entirely by primaries, but in the early primaries, he was successful. He did not have all the delegates he needed at the convention in 1932. You needed to have, I forget if it was 2/3 or whatever, but he didn't have them all. And he made a deal at the end with the Texas and California delegations to put Speaker of the House John Nance Garner of Texas on as vice president, and they gave him those delegates that he needed, and he became the nominee. He flew to Chicago the first time a presidential candidate flew to the convention. You weren't even supposed to go to the convention. They would come and tell you you got the nomination later. But he flew and he gave that famous New Deal speech at the Democratic Convention in Chicago. 1932, he goes on, you know, barnstorms the country. We know the rest of the story. I mean, I think I just want to give you a couple other things that he did in those years because they're interesting. He was there in 1931 when the Empire State Building opened and dedicated that. Hoover was there, and Al Smith was the business manager. He'd gone into business, and he was there presiding over the event. He was there to dedicate the George Washington Bridge in 1931 and the Teddy Roosevelt Memorial at the American Museum of Natural History. And being from the North Country, I always have to throw this in. He opened the 1932 Winter Olympics in Lake Placid, and Hoover didn't show up. And I said this the last time I was here, and somebody said who knew a lot about the Roosevelts. I never heard that before. Yes, Eleanor went down the bobsled. Now, the American bobsledder said later, well, we just took her down the easy part at the end, you know. But they were obviously all over the place. And so I guess I just want to kind of wrap up because we really want to take some questions and just say to you that a couple things. The legacy of the Roosevelts, as I said, it began really in Albany. The legacy, we know the history of the New Deal. We know that they tried so many things, and so many of them are still with us that changed our country forever. They were a dynamic couple. I didn't get into the whole thing about their personal relationship, which many of you may know, but they stayed together as a couple. And Doris Kearns Goodwin famously has said, Franklin Roosevelt knew what could be done. Eleanor Roosevelt knew what should be done. And she was forever the advocate with him and left her own legacy, being appointed by Truman to be the head of the UN Declaration of Human Rights, to go to the UN and preside over that. She went to that Japanese internment camp and told Franklin when she came back to close it. She went to the Fort Ontario camp on near Syracuse, and Jewish refugees had come on a boat, and it was the only time they were allowed in the United States during the war. She walked in and they couldn't believe that they said, "Who is that woman?" The First Lady of the United States. She went everywhere where she felt she could make a difference. And you know, she died 30 days to the day that he was elected president. She died on election day in 1962. And it's one of my first memories as a child, 9 years old, hearing the election results and saying that Eleanor Roosevelt had passed away. So this has been for me a wonderful COVID book that I wrote. I enjoyed reading it. My wife, Kate, is here, and she said, I felt like I was living with Eleanor and Franklin for 2 years because you would come home and say, guess what I found out today, you know? I would just add here that we're lucky that, you know, in the state of New York, that we had that kind of leadership. I think it has also influenced all of the leaders from there. You know, when I mentioned, when I began, I'll close with this, that when I was here in 1985 at the 50th anniversary of Social Security, FDR Jr. was the master of ceremonies. The keynote speaker was Mario Cuomo, and Mario Cuomo was his political descendant, who talked all about the family of New York and how Roosevelt had made it possible for people to believe that Social Security, the government, could help people who were in difficult times to be able to have a good quality of life and economically survive. So thank you, and let's take some questions. This could have gone on a couple hours, but I had to shorten it, you know. Anybody have anything they'd like to respond to or ask about? I'm actually hoping that 4 years from now, in 2028, I find it not really good that the city of Albany doesn't have a fitting memorial to the Roosevelts. And my wife and I were talking on the way down. If you've been to Albany and you've seen the Empire State Plaza, and there's the tall building, that's the health department, and there's 4 other buildings that are made of marble that emptied out the quarries in Vermont, that those buildings which have no names, building number 1, building 2, we have to name these buildings after Eleanor and Franklin and other people who were so great in our history here. Anything else?
You spoke about, thank you for the talk. You spoke about the Republican upstate, and Dutchess County was primarily Republican. Did FDR carry his own county when he was elected?
I don't remember exactly, but I think the answer is no. I think he did. I think I read that he did not carry Dutchess County. I'm not, now that would be in the, we'd have to check that, whether that was the case with the governor's race as well as the presidential race, but that's a very good question. But I think the answer might be no. Does anybody else know who's from the area? Yeah.
No, he never carried Dutchess County for the presidency, although everyone around claimed that they voted for him.
Yeah, I guess things were pretty red and blue back then also.
I was wondering a little bit about FDR and Frances Perkins, because I know earlier she had been fairly critical of him.
Mhm.
And so I'm wondering, did she turn him around, or did he turn her around in terms of their more productive relationship going forward and her being part of his presidential cabinet?
I would say both. I think that he saw in her a great person, a great skill, a knowledgeable person, and felt that he needed her. And then, of course, they worked closely together. He relied on her a lot. And I know that as president, you know, there's kind of a famous story was that she told him when he wanted to appoint her in Washington as Secretary of Labor, no, you should if you want a woman, get a woman who's been in the labor movement, you know, or in unions. And he said, no, I want you. And she said, well, if you want me, then we're going to do minimum wage and Social Security and a whole bunch of other things that I want to do. And he accepted that, you know, and that actually became a big part of the agenda. So I think they had a good working relationship. And of course, when he came back to run for governor, you know, he was not 28 years old like when she first met him. He was, by that time, 18 years later, he was 46. And he had been through the experience of polio, and people say, you know, that obviously had a big impact on him. And I think that he saw that he could work with her, and he especially needed her during the Depression. There's been many books written about her, of course, too. Maybe there's some here in the library, in the bookstore.
All right, folks, how about another round of applause for our speaker? And you can chat further with Michael out at the book signing tables, and we'll be back here at the top of the hour for our final session.